Chapter 6. 1. My hopes were not fully realized. I did not find them alone, though Versilov was not at home. Tatyana Pavlovna was sitting with my mother, and she was, after all, not one of the family. Fully half of my magnanimous feelings disappeared instantly. It is wonderful how hasty and changeable I am. In such cases a straw, a grain of sand, is enough to dissipate my good mood and replace it by a bad one. My bad impressions, I regret to say, are not so quickly dispelled, though I am not resentful. When I went in, I had a feeling that my mother immediately and hastily broke off what she was saying to Tatyana Pavlovna. I fancied they were talking very eagerly. My sister turned from her work only for a moment to look at me, and did not come out of her little alcove again. The flat consisted of 3 rooms. The room in which we usually sat, the middle room or drawing room, was fairly large and almost presentable. In it were soft red armchairs, and a sofa, very much the worse for wear, however. Versilov could not endure covers on furniture. There were rugs of a sort and several tables, including some useless little ones. On the right was Versilov's room, cramped and narrow with one window. It was furnished with a wretched-looking writing table covered with unused books and crumpled papers, and an equally wretched-looking easy-chair with a broken spring that stuck up in one corner and often made Versilov groan and swear. On an equally threadbare sofa in this room he used to sleep. He hated this study of his, and I believe he never did anything in it. He preferred sitting idle for hours together in the drawing-room. On the left of the drawing-room there was another room of the same sort, in which my mother and sister slept. The drawing-room was entered from the passage, at the end of which was the kitchen, where the cook Lucaria lived, and when she cooked she ruthlessly filled the whole flat with the smell of burnt fat. There were moments when Versilov cursed his life and fate aloud on account of the smell from the kitchen, and in that one matter I sympathized with him fully. I hated that smell too, though it did not penetrate to my room. I lived upstairs in an attic under the roof, to which I climbed by a very steep and shaky ladder. The only things worth mentioning in it were a semicircular window, a low-pitched ceiling, a sofa covered with American leather, on which at night Lucaria spread sheets and put a pillow for me. The rest of the furniture consisted of 2 articles, a perfectly plain deal table and a wooden rush-bottomed chair. We still preserved, however, some relics of our former comfort. In the drawing-room, for instance, we had a fairly decent china lamp, and on the wall hung a large and splendid engraving of the Sistine Madonna. Facing it on the other wall was an immense and expensive photograph of the cast bronze gates of the Cathedral of Florence. In the corner of the same room was a shrine of old-fashioned family icons, one of which had a gilt silver setting, the one they had meant to pawn, while another, the image of Our Lady, had a velvet setting embroidered in pearls. Under the icons hung a little lamp, which was lighted on every holiday. Versilov evidently had no feeling for the icons in their inner meaning and religious significance, but he restrained himself. He merely screwed up his eyes, sometimes complaining that the lamplight reflected in the gilt setting hurt them, but he did not hinder my mother from lighting the lamp. I usually entered in gloomy silence, looking away into some corner, and sometimes without even greeting anyone. As a rule, I returned earlier than today, and they used to send my dinner to me upstairs. Going into the room, I said, "Good evening, Mother," a thing I had never done before, though even this time I was unable from a sort of bashfulness to make myself look at her, and I sat down in the opposite corner of the room. I was awfully tired, but I did not think of that. "That lout of yours still walks in as rudely as ever," Tatyana Pavlovna hissed at me. She had been in the habit in old days of using abusive epithets to me, and it had become an established tradition between us. My mother faltered, "Good evening," to me, using the formal mode of address, and evidently embarrassed at my greeting her. "Your dinner has been ready a long while," she added, almost overcome by confusion. "I hope the soup is not cold. I will order the cutlets at once." She was hastily jumping up to go to the kitchen, and, for the first time perhaps during that whole month, I felt ashamed that she should run about to wait on me so humbly, though till that moment I had expected it of her. "Thank you very much, Mother. I have had dinner already. May I stay and rest here if I am not in the way?" "Oh, of course. How can you ask? Pray sit down." "Don't worry yourself, Mother. I won't be rude to Andrei Petrovitch again," I rapped out all at once. "Good heavens, how noble of him!" cried Tatyana Pavlovna. "Sonia, darling, you don't mean to say you still stand on ceremony with him? Who is he to be treated with such deference, and by his own mother, too? Look at you! Why, you behave as though you were afraid of him. It is disgraceful." "I should like it very much, Mother, if you would call me Arkasha." "Oh, yes, certainly I will," my mother said hurriedly. "I don't always. Henceforward I will." She blushed all over. Certainly her face had at times a great charm. It had a look of simplicity, but by no means of stupidity. It was rather pale and anemic. Her cheeks were very thin, even hollow. Her forehead was already lined by many wrinkles, but there were none around her eyes, and her eyes were rather large and wide open, and shone with a gentle and serene light which had drawn me to her from the very first day. I liked her face, too, because it did not look particularly depressed or drawn. On the contrary, her expression would have been positively cheerful, if she had not been so often agitated, sometimes almost panic-stricken over trifles, starting up from her seat for nothing at all, or listening in alarm to anything new that was said, till she was sure that all was well and as before. What mattered to her was just that all should be as before, that there should be no change, that nothing new should happen, not even new happiness. It might have been thought that she had been frightened as a child. Besides her eyes, I liked the oval of her rather long face, and I believe if it had been made a shade less broad across the cheekbones, she might have been called beautiful, not only in her youth, but even now. She was not more than 39, but grey hairs were already visible in her chestnut hair. Tatyana Pavlovna glanced at her in genuine indignation. "A booby like him? And you tremble before him! You are ridiculous, Sofya! You make me angry, I tell you!" "Ah, Tatyana Pavlovna, why should you attack him now? But you are joking, perhaps, eh?" my mother added, detecting something like a smile on Tatyana Pavlovna's face. Her scoldings could not indeed be always taken seriously. But she smiled, if she did smile, only at my mother, of course, because she loved her devotedly, and no doubt noticed how happy she was at that moment at my meekness. Of course I can't help feeling hurt if you will attack people unprovoked, Tatyana Pavlovna. And just when I've come in saying, 'Good evening, Mother,' a thing I've never done before. I thought it necessary to observe at last. Only fancy, she boiled over at once. He considers it as something to be proud of. Am I to go down on my knees to you, pray, because for once in your life you've been polite, and as though it were politeness? Why do you stare into the corner when you come in? I know how you tear and fling about before her. You might have said good evening to me, too. I wrapped you in your swaddling clothes. I am your godmother. I need not say I did not deign to answer. At that moment my sister came in, and I made haste to turn to her. Lisa, I saw Vassin today, and he inquired after you. Have you met him? Yes, last year in Luga, she answered quite simply, sitting down beside me and looking at me affectionately. I don't know why, but I had fancied she would flush when I spoke of Vassin. My sister was a blonde, very fair with flaxen hair, quite unlike both her parents. But her eyes and the oval of her face were like our mother's. Her nose was very straight, small, and regular. There were tiny freckles in her face, however, of which there was no sign in my mother's. There was very little resemblance to Versilov. Nothing but the slenderness of figure, perhaps, and her tallness and something charming in her carriage. There was not the slightest likeness between us. We were the opposite poles. I knew His Honor for 3 months, Lisa added. Is it Vassin you call His Honor, Lisa? You should call him by his name. Excuse my correcting you, sister, but it grieves me that they seem to have neglected your education. But it's shameful of you to remark upon it before your mother, cried Tatyana Pavlovna, firing up. And you are talking nonsense. It has not been neglected at all. I am not saying anything about my mother, I said sharply, defending myself. Do you know, Mother, that when I look at Lisa, it's as though it were you over again. You have given her the same charm of goodness which you must have had yourself, and you have it to this day and always will have it. And I was only talking of the surface polish, of the silly rules of etiquette, which are necessary, however. I am only indignant at the thought that when Versilov has heard you call Vassin His Honor, he has not troubled to correct you at all. His disdain and his indifference to us are so complete. That's what makes me furious. He is a perfect bear himself, and he is giving us lessons in good manners. Don't you dare talk of Versilov before your mother, sir, or before me either. I won't stand it. Tatyana Pavlovna flashed out. I got my salary today, Mother, 50 rubles. Take it, please, here. I went up to her and gave her the money. She was in a tremor of anxiety at once. Oh, I don't know about taking it, she brought out, as though afraid to touch the money. I did not understand. For goodness sake, Mother, if you both think of me as one of the family, as a son and a brother— Oh, I've been to blame, Arkady. I ought to have confessed something to you, but I am afraid of you. She said this with a timid and deprecating smile. Again I did not understand and interrupted. By the way, did you know, Mother, that Andrei Petrovitch's case against the Sokolskys is being decided today? Ah, I knew, she cried, clasping her hands before her, her favorite gesture, in alarm. Today? Cried Tatyana Pavlovna, startled. But 'tis impossible. He would have told us. Did he tell you? She turned to my mother. Oh, no, that it was today he didn't, but I have been fearing it all the week. I would have prayed for him to lose it even, only to have it over and off one's mind, and to have things as they used to be again. What, hasn't he even told you, Mother? I exclaimed. What a man! There's an example of the indifference and contempt I spoke of just now. It's being decided? How is it being decided? And who told you? Cried Tatyana Pavlovna, pouncing upon me. Speak, do. Why, here he is himself. Perhaps he will tell you, I announced, catching the sound of his step in the passage and hastily sitting down again beside Lisa. Brother, for God's sake, spare Mother, and be patient with Andrei Petrovitch, she whispered to me. I will. With that I turned to her and pressed her hand. Lisa looked at me very mistrustfully, and she was right. 2. He came in very much pleased with himself, so pleased that he did not feel it necessary to conceal his state of mind. And indeed he had become accustomed of late to displaying himself before us without the slightest ceremony, not only in his bad points, but even where he was ridiculous, a thing which most people are afraid to do. At the same time, he fully recognized that we should understand to the smallest detail. In the course of the last year, so Tatyana Pavlovna observed, he had become slovenly in his dress. His clothes, though old, were always well cut and free from foppishness. It is true that he was prepared to put on clean linen only on every alternate day instead of every day, which was a real distress to my mother. It was regarded by them as a sacrifice, and the whole group of devoted women looked upon it as an act of heroism. He always wore soft, wide-brimmed black hats. When he took off his hat, his very thick but silvery locks stood up in a shock on his head. I liked looking at his hair when he took off his hat. Good evening, still disputing. And is he actually one of the party? I heard his voice from outside in the passage. He has been attacking me, I suppose. It was one of the signs of his being in a good humour for him to be witty at my expense. I did not answer, of course. Lucaria came in with a regular sackful of parcels and put them on the table. Victory! Tatyana Pavlovna, the case is won, and the Sokolskys certainly won't venture to appeal. I've won the day. I was able to borrow 1,000 rubles at once. Sonia, put down your work, don't try your eyes. Back from work, Lisa? Yes, father, answered Lisa, looking at him affectionately. She used to call him father. Nothing would have induced me to submit to doing the same. Tired? Yes. Give up your work, don't go tomorrow, and drop it altogether. Father, that will be worse for me. I beg you will. I greatly dislike to see women working, Tatyana Pavlovna. How can they get on without work? A woman's not to work. I know. That's excellent and very true, and I agree with it beforehand. But I mean needlework particularly. Only imagine, I believe that's one of the morbid, anomalous impressions of my childhood. In my dim memories of the time when I was 5 or 6 years old, I remember more often than anything, with loathing of course, a solemn council of wise women, stern and forbidding, sitting at a round table with scissors, material, patterns, and a fashion plate. They thought they knew all about it, and shook their heads slowly and majestically, measuring, calculating, and preparing to cut out. All those kind people who were so fond of me had suddenly become unapproachable, and if I began to play, I was carried out of the room at once. Even my poor nurse, who held me by the hand and took no notice of my shouting and pulling at her, was listening and gazing enraptured, as though at a kind of paradise. The sternness of those sensible faces, and the solemnity with which they faced the task of cutting out, is for some reason distressing for me to picture even now. Tatyana Pavlovna, you are awfully fond of cutting out. Although it may be aristocratic, yet I do prefer a woman who does not work at all. Don't take that as meant for you, Sonia. How could you, indeed? Woman is an immense power without working. You know that, though, Sonia. What's your opinion, Arkady Makarovich? No doubt you disagree. No, not at all, I answered. That's a particularly good saying, that woman is an immense power, though I don't understand why you say that about work. And she can't help working if she has no money, as you know yourself. Well, that's enough. And he turned to my mother, who positively beamed all over. When he addressed me, she was all of a tremor. At least, to begin with, I beg you not to let me see you doing needlework for me. No doubt, Arkady, as a young man of the period, you are something of a socialist. Well, would you believe it, my dear fellow, none are so fond of idleness as the toiling masses. Rest, perhaps, not idleness. No, idleness, doing nothing, that's their ideal. I knew a man who was forever at work, though he was not one of the common people. He was rather intellectual and capable of generalizing. Every day of his life, perhaps, he brooded with blissful emotion on visions of utter idleness, raising the ideal to infinity, so to speak, to unlimited independence, to everlasting freedom, dreaming and idle contemplation. So it went on till he broke down altogether from overwork. There was no mending him. He died in a hospital. I am sometimes seriously disposed to believe that the delights of labor have been invented by the idle, from virtuous motives, of course. It is one of the Geneva ideas of the end of the last century. Tatyana Pavlovna, I cut an advertisement out of the newspaper the day before yesterday. Here it is. He took a scrap of paper out of his waistcoat pocket. It is one of those everlasting students, proficient in classics and mathematics, and prepared to travel, to sleep in a garret or anywhere. Here, listen. A teacher, lady, prepares for all the scholastic establishments. Do you hear? For all. And gives lessons in arithmetic. Prepares for all the scholastic establishments. In arithmetic, therefore, may we assume? No, arithmetic is something apart for her. It is a case of simple hunger, the last extremity of want. It is just the ineptitude of it that's so touching. It's evident that the lady has never prepared anyone for any school, and it is doubtful whether she is fit to teach anything. Yet at her last gasp she wastes her one remaining rouble and prints in the paper that she prepares for all the scholastic establishments, and, what's more, gives lessons in arithmetic. Per tutto mondo e in altri city. Oh, Andrei Petrovitch, she ought to be helped. Where does she live? Cried Tatyana Pavlovna. Oh, there are lots of them. He put the advertisement in his pocket. That bag's full of treats for you, Lisa, and you, Tatyana Pavlovna. Sonia and I don't care for sweet things. And perhaps for you, young man. I bought the things myself at Elisiev's and at Ballet's. Too long we've gone hungry, as Lucaria said. Nota bene, none of us had ever gone hungry. Here are grapes, sweets, duchesses, and strawberry tarts. I've even brought some excellent liqueur. Nuts, too. It's curious that to this day I'm fond of nuts as I have been from a child, Tatyana Pavlovna, and of the commonest nuts, do you know. Lisa takes after me. She is fond of cracking nuts like a squirrel. But there's nothing more charming, Tatyana Pavlovna, than sometimes, when recalling one's childhood, to imagine oneself in a wood, in a copse, gathering nuts. The days are almost autumnal, but bright. At times it's so fresh, one hides in the bushes, one wanders in the wood, there's a scent of leaves. I seem to see something sympathetic in your face, Arkady Makarovich. The early years of my childhood, too, were spent in the country. But I thought you were brought up in Moscow, if I'm not mistaken. He was living in Moscow at the Andronikovs when you went there, but till then he used to live in the country with your aunt, Varvara Stepanovna, Tatyana Pavlovna put in. Sonia, here's some money, put it away. I promise you, in a few days, 5,000. So there's no hope, then, for the Sokolskys? Asked Tatyana Pavlovna. Absolutely none, Tatyana Pavlovna. I have always sympathized with you and all of yours, Andrei Petrovich, and I have always been a friend of the family. But though the Sokolskys are strangers, yet, upon my word, I am sorry for them. Don't be angry, Andrei Petrovich. I have no intention of going shares with them, Tatyana Pavlovna. You know my idea, of course, Andrei Petrovich. They would have settled the case out of court, if at the very beginning you had offered to go halves with them. Now, of course, it is too late. Not that I venture to criticize. I say so because I don't think the deceased would have left them out of his will altogether. Not only he wouldn't have left them out, he'd have certainly left them everything, and would have left none out but me, if he'd known how to do things and to write a will properly. But as it is, the law's on my side, and it's settled. I can't go shares, and I don't want to, Tatyana Pavlovna, and that is the end of the matter. He spoke with real exasperation, a thing he had rarely allowed himself to do. Tatyana Pavlovna subsided. My mother looked down mournfully. Versilov knew that she shared Tatyana Pavlovna's views. He has not forgotten that slap in the face at Ems, I thought to myself. The document given me by Kraft, and at that moment in my pocket, would have a poor chance if it had fallen into his hands. I suddenly felt that the whole responsibility was still weighing upon me, and this idea, together with all the rest, had, of course, an irritating effect upon me. Arkady, I should like you to be better dressed, my dear fellow. Your suit is all right, but for future contingencies I might recommend you to an excellent Frenchman, most conscientious and possessed of taste. I beg you never to make such suggestions again, I burst out suddenly. What's that? It is not that I consider it humiliating, of course, but we are not agreed about anything. On the contrary, our views are entirely opposed, for in a day or two, tomorrow, I shall give up going to the prince's, as I find there is absolutely no work for me to do there. But you are going and sitting there with him. That is the work. Such ideas are degrading. I don't understand. But if you are so squeamish, don't take money from him, but simply go. You will distress him horribly. He has already become attached to you, I assure you. However, as you please. He was evidently put out. You say, don't ask for money, but thanks to you I did a mean thing today. You did not warn me, and I demanded my month's salary from him today. So you have seen to that already. I confess I did not expect you to ask for it, But how sharp you all are nowadays! There are no young people in these days, Tatyana Pavlovna." She was very spiteful. I was awfully angry, too. "I ought to have had things out with you. You made me do it. I don't know now how it's to be. By the way, Sonia, give Arkady back his 60 roubles at once. And you, my dear fellow, don't be angry at our repaying it so quickly. I can guess from your face that you have some enterprise in your mind, and that you need it. So invest it, or something of the sort. I don't know what my face expresses, but I did not expect Mother would have told you of that money when I so particularly asked her." I looked at my mother with flashing eyes. I cannot express how wounded I felt. "Arkasha, darling, for God's sake forgive me. I couldn't possibly help speaking of it." "My dear fellow, don't make a grievance of her telling me your secrets. Besides, she did it with the best intentions. It was simply a mother's longing to boast of her son's feeling for her. But I assure you I should have guessed without that you were a capitalist. All your secrets are written on your honest countenance. He has his idea, Tatyana Pavlovna, as I told you." "Let's drop my honest countenance," I burst out again. "I know that you often see right through things, but in some cases you see no further than your own nose, and I have marveled at your powers of penetration. Well, then, I have my idea. That you should use that expression, of course, was an accident, but I am not afraid to admit it. I have an idea of my own. I am not afraid, and I am not ashamed of it." "Don't be ashamed, that's the chief thing." "And all the same, I shall never tell it you." "That's to say, you won't condescend to." "No need to, my dear fellow. I know the nature of your idea as it is. In any case, it implies, 'Into the wilderness I flee.' Tatyana Pavlovna, my notion is that he wants to become a Rothschild or something of the kind, and shut himself up in his grandeur. No doubt he'll magnanimously allow us a pension, though perhaps he won't allow me one. But in any case he will vanish from our sight. Like the new moon he has risen, only to set again." I shuddered in my inmost being. Of course it was all chance. He knew nothing of my idea and was not speaking about it, though he did mention Rothschild. But how could he define my feelings so precisely, my impulse to break with them and go away? He divined everything, and wanted to defile beforehand with his cynicism the tragedy of fact. That he was horribly angry, of that there could be no doubt. "Mother, forgive my hastiness, for I see that there's no hiding things from Andrei Petrovitch in any case," I said, affecting to laugh, and trying, if only for a moment, to turn it into a joke. "That's the very best thing you can do, my dear fellow, to laugh. It is difficult to realize how much everyone gains by laughing, even in appearance. I am speaking most seriously. He always has an air, Tatyana Pavlovna, of having something so important on his mind that he is quite abashed at the circumstance himself. I must ask you in earnest, Andrei Petrovitch, to be more careful what you say." "You are right, my dear boy, but one must speak out once for all, so as never to touch upon the matter again. You have come to us from Moscow to begin making trouble at once. That's all we know as yet of your object in coming. I say nothing, of course, of your having come to surprise us in some way. And all this month you have been snorting and sneering at us. Yet you are obviously an intelligent person, and as such you might leave such snorting and sneering to those who have no other means of avenging themselves on others for their own insignificance. You are always shutting yourself up, though your honest countenance and your rosy cheeks bear witness that you might look everyone straight in the face with perfect innocence. He's a neurotic. I can't make out, Tatyana Pavlovna, why they are all neurotics nowadays. If you do not even know where I was brought up, you are not likely to know why a man's neurotic. Oh, so that's the key to it. You are offended at my being capable of forgetting where you were brought up. Not in the least. Don't attribute such silly ideas to me. Mother, Andrei Petrovitch praised me just now for laughing. Let us laugh. Why sit like this? Shall I tell you a little anecdote about myself? Especially as Andrei Petrovitch knows nothing of my adventures. I was boiling. I knew this was the last time we should be sitting together like this, that when I left that house I should never enter it again, and so on the eve of it all I could not restrain myself. He had challenged me to such a parting scene himself. "That will be delightful, of course, if it is really amusing," he observed, looking at me searchingly. "Your manners were rather neglected where you were brought up, my dear fellow, though they are pretty passable. He is charming today, Tatyana Pavlovna, and it's a good thing you have undone that bag at last." But Tatyana Pavlovna frowned. She did not even turn round at his words, but went on untying the parcels and laying out the good things on some plates which had been brought in. My mother, too, was sitting in complete bewilderment, though she had misgivings, of course, and realized that there would be trouble between us. My sister touched my elbow again. 3. "I simply want to tell you all," I began, with a very free and easy air, "how a father met for the first time a dearly loved son. It happened wherever you were brought up. My dear fellow, won't it be a dull story? You know, tout le genre. Don't frown, Andrei Petrovitch. I am not speaking at all with the object you imagine. All I want is to make everyone laugh. Well, God hears you, my dear boy. I know that you love us all, and don't want to spoil our evening," he mumbled with a sort of affected carelessness. "Of course you have guessed by my face that I love you." "Yes, partly by your face, too." "Just as I guessed from her face that Tatyana Pavlovna's in love with me. Don't look at me so ferociously, Tatyana Pavlovna. It is better to laugh. It is better to laugh." She turned quickly to me and gave me a searching look which lasted half a minute. "Mind now," she said, holding up her finger at me, but so earnestly that her words could not have referred to my stupid joke, but must have been meant as a warning in case I might be up to some mischief. "Andrei Petrovitch, is it possible you don't remember how we met for the first time in our lives?" "Upon my word, I've forgotten, my dear fellow, and I am really very sorry. All that I remember is that it was a long time ago, and took place somewhere. Mother, and don't you remember how you were in the country where I was brought up, till I was 6 or 7, I believe? Or rather, were you really there once, or is it simply a dream that I saw you there for the first time? I have been wanting to ask you about it for a long time, but I've kept putting it off. Now the time has come." "To be sure, Akasha, to be sure I stayed with Varvara Stepanovna 3 times. My first visit was when you were only a year old, I came a second time when you were nearly 4, and afterwards again when you were 6. Ah, you did then. I have been wanting to ask you about it all this month. My mother seemed overwhelmed by a rush of memories, and she asked me with feeling, "Do you really mean, Arkasha, that you remembered me there?" "I don't know or remember anything. Only something of your face remained in my heart for the rest of my life, and the fact, too, that you were my mother. I recall everything there as though it were a dream. I've even forgotten my nurse. I have a faint recollection of Varvara Stepanovna, simply that her face was tied up for toothache. I remember huge trees near the house, lime trees I think they were. Then sometimes the brilliant sunshine at the open windows, the little flower garden, the little paths, and you, Mother, I remember clearly only at one moment when I was taken to the church there, and you held me up to receive the sacrament and to kiss the chalice. It was in the summer, and a dove flew through the cupola, in at one window and out at another." "Mercy on us, that's just how it was!" cried my mother, throwing up her hands. "And the dear dove I remember too now. With the chalice just before you, you started and cried out, 'A dove, a dove!'" Your face, or something of the expression, remained in my memory so distinctly that I recognized you 5 years after in Moscow, though nobody there told me you were my mother. But when I met Andrei Petrovitch for the first time, I was brought from the Andronikovs. I had been vegetating quietly and happily with them for 5 years on end. I remember their flat down to the smallest detail, and all those ladies who have all grown so much older here, and the whole household, and how Andronikov himself used to bring the provisions, poultry, fish, and sucking pigs down from the town in a fish basket. And how at dinner, instead of his wife, who always gave herself such airs, he used to help ladle the soup, and how we all laughed at his doing it, he most of all. The young ladies there used to teach me French, but what I liked best of all was Krylov's fables. I learned a number of them by heart, and every day I used to recite one to Andronikov, going straight into his tiny study to do so, without considering whether he were busy or not. Well, it was through a fable of Krylov's that I got to know you, Andrei Petrovitch. I see you are beginning to remember. I do recall something, my dear fellow, that you repeated something to me. A fable or a passage from Woe from Wit, I fancy. What a memory you have, though. A memory? I should think so. It's the one thing I've remembered all my life. That's all right, my dear fellow. You are quite waking me up. He actually smiled. As soon as he smiled, my mother and sister smiled after him. Confidence was restored. But Tatyana Pavlovna, who had finished laying out the good things on the table and settled herself in a corner, still bent upon me a keen and disapproving eye. "This is how it happened," I went on. "One fine morning, there suddenly appeared the friend of my childhood, Tatyana Pavlovna, who always made her entrance on the stage of my existence with dramatic suddenness. She took me away in a carriage to a grand house, to sumptuous apartments. You were staying at Madame Fenaryatov's, Andrei Petrovitch, in her empty house, which she had bought from you. She was abroad at that time. I always used to wear short jackets. Now, all of a sudden, I was put into a pretty little blue greatcoat and a very fine shirt. Tatyana Pavlovna was busy with me all day and bought me lots of things. I kept walking through all the empty rooms, looking at myself in all the looking-glasses, and wandering about in the same way the next morning, at 10 o'clock, I walked quite by chance into your study. I had seen you already the evening before, as soon as I was brought into the house, but only for an instant on the stairs. You were coming downstairs to get into your carriage and drive off somewhere. You were staying alone in Moscow then, for a short time after a very long absence, so that you had engagements in all directions and were scarcely ever at home. When you met Tatyana Pavlovna and me, you only drawled, "Ah," and did not even stop. "He describes it with a special love," observed Versilov, addressing Tatyana Pavlovna. She turned away and did not answer. "I can see you now as you were then, handsome and flourishing. It is wonderful how much older and less good-looking you have grown in these years. Please forgive this candor. You were 37 even then, though. I gazed at you with admiration. What wonderful hair you had, almost jet black, with a brilliant luster without a trace of grey, mustaches and whiskers like the setting of a jewel. I can find no other expression for it. Your face of an even pallor, not like its sickly pallor today, but like your daughter, Anna Andreevna, whom I had the honor of seeing this morning. Dark, glowing eyes and gleaming teeth, especially when you laughed. And you did laugh when you looked round as I came in. I was not very discriminating at that time, and your smile rejoiced my heart. That morning you were wearing a dark blue velvet jacket, a sulphur-colored necktie, and a magnificent shirt with Alençon lace on it. You were standing before the looking-glass with a manuscript in your hand, and you were busy declaiming Tchatsky's monologue, and especially his last exclamation, "A coach! I want a coach!" "Good heavens!" cried Versilov. "Why, he's right. Though I was only in Moscow for so short a time, I undertook to play Tchatsky in an amateur performance at Alexandra Petrovna Vitovtov's, in place of Zhileko, who was ill." "Do you mean to say you had forgotten it?" laughed Tatyana Pavlovna. "He has brought it back to my mind, and I own that those few days in Moscow were perhaps the happiest in my life. We were still so young then, and all so fervently expecting something. It was then in Moscow I unexpectedly met so much. Oh, but go on, my dear fellow. This time you've done well to remember it all so exactly." I stood still to look at you, and suddenly cried out, "Ah, how good, the real Tchatsky!" You turned round at once and asked, "Why, do you know Tchatsky already?" And you sat down on a sofa and began drinking your coffee in the most charming humour. I could have kissed you. Then I informed you that at the Andronikovs every one read a great deal, and that the young ladies knew a great deal of poetry by heart, and used to act scenes out of Woe from Wit among themselves, and that all last week we had been reading aloud in the evening a sportsman's sketches, but what I liked best of all was Krylov's fables, and that I knew them by heart. You told me to repeat one, and I repeated The Girl Who Was Hard to Please. A maid her suitor shrewdly scanned. Yes, I remember it all now," cried Versilov again. "But, my dear fellow, I remember you too clearly now. You were such a charming boy then, a thoughtful boy even, and I assure you, you too have changed for the worse in the course of these 9 years." At this point all of them, even Tatyana Pavlovna, laughed. It was evident that Andrei Petrovitch had deigned to jest, and had paid me out in the same coin for my biting remark about his having grown old. Everyone was amused, and indeed it was well said. As I recited, you smiled, but before I was halfway through the fable, you rang the bell, and told the footman who answered it to ask Tatyana Pavlovna to come. And she ran in with such a delighted face that though I had seen her the evening before, I scarcely knew her. For Tatyana Pavlovna I began the fable again. I finished it brilliantly. Even Tatyana Pavlovna smiled, and you, Andrei Petrovitch, cried bravo, and observed with warmth that if it had been the ant and the grasshopper, it would not be wonderful that a sensible boy of my age should recite it sensibly. But this fable, a maid her suitor shrewdly scanned, indeed that's not a crime, was different. Listen how he brings out, indeed that's not a crime, you said. In fact, you were enthusiastic. Then you said something in French to Tatyana Pavlovna, and she instantly frowned and began to protest, and grew very hot, in fact. But as it was impossible to oppose Andrei Petrovitch, if once he took an idea into his head, she hurriedly carried me off to her room. There my hands and face were washed again, my shirt was changed, my hair was pomaded and even curled. Then, towards evening, Tatyana Pavlovna dressed herself up rather grandly, as I had never expected to see her, and she took me with her in the carriage. It was the first time in my life I had been to a play. It was at a private performance at Madame Vitovtov's. The lights, the chandeliers, the ladies, the officers, the generals, the young ladies, the curtain, the rows of chairs, were utterly unlike anything I had seen before. Tatyana Pavlovna took a very modest seat in one of the back rows, and made me sit down beside her. There were, of course, other children like me in the room, but I had no eyes for anything. I simply waited with a sinking of my heart for the performance. When you came on, Andrei Petrovitch, I was ecstatic to the point of tears. What for and why, I don't understand. Why those tears of rapture? It has been a strange recollection for me ever since for these last 9 years. I followed the drama with a throbbing heart. All I understood of it, of course, was that she was deceiving him, and that he was ridiculed by stupid people who were not worth his little finger. When he was reciting at the ball, I understood that he was humiliated and insulted, that he was reproaching all these miserable people, but that he was great, great. No doubt my training at the Andronikovs helped me to understand. And your acting, Andrei Petrovitch, it was the first time I had seen a play. When you went off shouting, "A coach, a coach!" and you did that shout wonderfully, I jumped up from my seat, and while the whole audience burst into applause, I too clapped my hands and cried "Bravo!" at the top of my voice. I vividly recall how at that instant I felt as though I had been pierced by a pin in my back, a little below the waist. Tatyana Pavlovna had given me a ferocious pinch, but I took no notice of it. As soon as Woe from Wit was over, Tatyana Pavlovna took me home, of course. "You can't stay for the dancing, and it's only on your account I'm not staying," you hissed at me all the way home in the carriage, Tatyana Pavlovna. All night I was delirious, and by 10 o'clock the next morning I was standing at the study door, but it was shut. There were people with you, and you were engaged in some business with them. Then you drove off and were away the whole day till late at night, so I did not see you again. What I meant to say to you I have forgotten, of course, and indeed I did not know then, but I longed passionately to see you as soon as possible. And at 8 o'clock next morning you were graciously pleased to set off for Serpukhov. At that time you had just sold your Tula estate to settle with your creditors, but there was still left in your hands a tempting stake. That was why you had come at that time to Moscow, where you had not been able to show yourself till then for fear of your creditors, and this Serpukhov ruffian was the only one of them who had not agreed to take half of what you owed him instead of the whole. When I questioned Tatyana Pavlovna, she did not even answer me. It's no business of yours, but the day after tomorrow I shall take you to your boarding school. Get your exercise books ready, take your lesson books, put them all in order, and you must learn to pack your little box yourself. You can't expect to be waited on, sir. You were drumming this and that into my ears all those 3 days, Tatyana Pavlovna. It ended in my being taken in my innocence to school at Touchard's, adoring you, Andrei Petrovitch. Our whole meeting was a trivial incident, perhaps, but would you believe it? 6 months afterwards I longed to run away from Touchard's to you. You describe it capitally. You have brought it all back so vividly, Versilov pronounced incisively. But what strikes me most in your story is the wealth of certain strange details. Concerning my debts, for instance. Apart from the fact that these details are hardly a suitable subject for you to discuss, I can't imagine how you managed to get hold of them. Details? How I got hold of them? Why, I repeat, for the last 9 years I have been doing nothing but getting hold of facts about you. A strange confession, and a strange way of spending your time. He turned half-reclining in his easy-chair, and even yawned slightly. Whether intentionally or not, I could not say. Well, shall I go on telling you how I wanted to run to you from Touchard's? Forbid him, Andrei Petrovitch. Suppress him and send him away, Tatyana Pavlovna burst out. That won't do, Tatyana Pavlovna, Versilov answered her impressively. Arkasha has evidently something on his mind, and so he must be allowed to finish. Well, let him speak. When he's said what he's got to say, it will be off his mind, and what matters most to him is that he should get it off his mind. Begin your new story, my dear fellow. I call it new, but you may rest assured that I know how it ends. IV. I ran away. That is, I tried to run away to you very simply. Tatyana Pavlovna, do you remember after I had been there a fortnight, Touchard wrote you a letter? Didn't he? Marya Ivanovna showed me the letter afterwards. That turned up among Andronikov's papers, too. Touchard suddenly discovered that the fees he had asked were too small, and with dignity announced in his letter to you that little princes and senators' children were educated in his establishment, and that it was lowering its tone to keep a pupil of such humble origin as me, unless the remuneration were increased. Mon cher, you really might— Oh, that's nothing, I interrupted. I am only going to say a little about Touchard. You wrote from the provinces a fortnight later, Tatyana Pavlovna, and answered with a flat refusal. I remember how he walked into our classroom, flushing crimson. He was a very short, thick-set little Frenchman of 45, a Parisian cobbler by origin, though he had from time immemorial held a position in Moscow as an instructor in the French language, and even had an official rank, of which he was extremely proud. He was a man of crass ignorance. There were only 6 of us pupils. Among them there actually was a nephew of a Moscow senator, and we all lived like one family under the supervision of his wife, a very affected lady who was the daughter of a Russian government clerk. During that fortnight I had given myself great airs before my schoolfellows. I boasted of my blue overcoat and my papa, Andrei Petrovitch, and their questions why I was called Dolgoruki and not Versilov did not embarrass me in the least, since I did not know why.
"Andrei Petrovitch!"
cried Tatyana Pavlovna, in a voice almost menacing. My mother, on the contrary, was watching me intently, and evidently wished me to go on. "C'est Touchard. I actually recall him now. He was a fussy little man," Versilov admitted. "But he was recommended to me by the very best people. C'est Touchard walked in with the letter in his hand, went up to the big oak table, at which all 6 of us were seated learning something by heart. He seized me firmly by the shoulder, picked me up from the chair, and ordered me to collect my exercise books. 'Your place is not here, but there,' he said, pointing to a tiny room on the left of the passage, where there was nothing but a plain deal table, a rush-bottom chair, and an American leather sofa, exactly like what I have upstairs in the attic. I went into it in amazement, very much downcast. I had never been roughly treated before. Half an hour later, when Touchard had gone out of the schoolroom, I began to exchange glances and smiles with my schoolfellows. They, of course, were laughing at me, but I had no suspicion of it, and thought we were laughing because we were merry. At that moment Touchard darted in, seized me by the forelock, and dragged me about. 'Don't you dare sit with the gentlemanly boys. You are a child of low origin, and no better than a lackey.' And he gave me a stinging blow on my chubby, rosy cheek. He must have enjoyed doing so, and he struck me a second time, and a third. I cried violently and was terribly astonished. For a whole hour I sat with my face hidden in my hands, crying and crying. Something had happened which was utterly beyond my comprehension. I don't understand how a man, not of spiteful character, a foreigner like Touchard, who rejoiced at the emancipation of the Russian peasants, could have beaten a foolish child like me. I was only amazed, not resentful, however. I had not yet learnt to resent an insult. It seemed to me that I had somehow been naughty, that when I was good again I should be forgiven, and that we should all be merry again at once, that we should go out to play in the yard and live happily ever after.
"My dear fellow, if I had only known,"
Versilov drawled with the careless smile of a rather weary man.
"What a scoundrel that Touchard was, though!
I have not given up all hope, however, that you may make an effort and forgive us for all that at last, and that we may all live happily ever after." He yawned decisively. "But I am not blaming you at all, and believe me, I am not complaining of Touchard," I cried, a little disconcerted. "Though indeed he beat me for 10 months or so. I remember I was always trying to appease him in some way. I used to rush to kiss his hands. I was always kissing them, and I was always crying and crying. My schoolfellows laughed at me and despised me, because Touchard began to treat me sometimes like a servant. He used to order me to bring him his clothes when he was dressing. My menial instincts were of use to me there. I did my very utmost to please him, and was not in the least offended, because I did not at that time understand it at all, and I am surprised to this day that I could have been so stupid as not to realize that I was not on an equal footing with the rest. It's true my schoolfellows made many things clear to me even then. It was a good school. Touchard came in the end to prefer giving me a kick to slapping me in the face, and 6 months later he even began to be affectionate, only he never failed to beat me once a month or so to remind me not to forget myself. He soon let me sit with the other boys too, and allowed me to play with them, But not once during those 2.5 years did Touchard forget the difference in our social positions, and from time to time, though not very frequently, he employed me in menial tasks, I verily believe to remind me of it. I was running away. That's to say, I was on the point of running away for 5 months after those first 2 months. I have always been slow in taking action. When I got into bed and pulled the quilt over me, I began thinking of you at once, Andrei Petrovitch. Only of you, of no one else. I don't in the least know why it was so. I dreamed about you, too. I used always to be passionately imagining that you would walk in, and I would rush up to you, and you would take me out of that place and bring me home with you to the same study, and that we would go to the theatre again, and so on. Above all, that we should not part again. That was the chief thing. As soon as I had to wake up in the morning, the jeers and contempt of the boys began again. One of them actually began beating me and making me put on his boots for him. He called me the vilest names, particularly aiming at making my origin clear to me, to the diversion of all who heard him. When at last Touchard himself became comprehensible, something unbearable began in my soul. I felt that I should never be forgiven here. Oh, I was beginning by degrees to understand what it was they would not forgive of me, and of what I was guilty. And so at last I resolved to run away. For 2 whole months I dreamed of it incessantly. At last, it was September, I made up my mind. I waited for Saturday, when my schoolfellows used to go home for the weekend, and meanwhile I secretly and carefully got together a bundle of the most necessary things. All the money I had was 2 roubles. I meant to wait till dusk. Then I will go downstairs, I thought, and I'll go out and walk away. Where? I knew that Andronikov had moved to Petersburg, and I resolved that I would look for Madame Fenaryatov's house in Arbaty. I'll spend the night walking or sitting somewhere, and in the morning I'll ask someone in the courtyard of the house where Andrei Petrovitch is now, and if not in Moscow, in what town or country. They will be sure to tell me. I'll walk away, and then ask someone somewhere else by which gate to go out to reach such a town, and then I'll go and walk and walk. I shall keep on walking. I shall sleep somewhere under the bushes. I shall eat nothing but bread, and for 2 roubles I can get bread enough for a long time. I could not manage to run away on Saturday, however. I had to wait till next day, Sunday, and as luck would have it, Touchard and his wife were going away somewhere for the Sunday. There was no one left in the house but Agafya and me. I waited the night in terrible agitation, I remember. I sat at the window in the schoolroom, looking out at the dusty street, the little wooden houses, and the few passers-by. Touchard lived in an out-of-the-way street. From the windows I could see one of the city gates. Isn't it the one? I kept wondering. The sun set in a red glow. The sun was so cold-looking, and a piercing wind was stirring up the dust, just as it is today. It was quite dark at last. I stood before the icon and began to pray, only very, very quickly. I was in haste. I caught up my bundle and went on tiptoe down the creaking stairs, horribly afraid that Agafya would hear me from the kitchen. The door was locked. I turned the key, and at once a dark, dark night loomed black before me, like a boundless, perilous, unknown land, and the wind snatched off my cap. I was just going out on the same side of the pavement. I heard a hoarse volley of oaths from a drunken man in the street. I stood, looked, and slowly turned, slowly went upstairs, slowly took off my things, put down my little bundle and lay down flat, without tears and without thoughts. And it was from that moment, Andrei Petrovitch, that I began to think. It was from that moment that I realized that, besides being a lackey, I was a coward too, and my real development began.
"Well, I see through you once and for all from this minute," cried Tatyana Pavlovna,
jumping up from her seat, and so suddenly that I was utterly unprepared for it.
"Yes, you were not only a lackey then, you are a lackey now. You've the soul of a lackey. Why should not Andrei Petrovitch have apprenticed you to a shoemaker? It would have been an act of charity to have taught you a trade. Who would have expected more than that of him? Your father, Makar Ivanovitch, asked, in fact he insisted, that you, his children, should not be brought up to be above your station. Why, you think nothing of his having educated you for the university, and that through him you have received class rights. The little rascals teased him, to be sure, so he has sworn to avenge himself on humanity. You scoundrel!"
I must confess I was struck dumb by this outburst. I got up and stood for a long time staring and not knowing what to say. "Well, certainly Tatyana Pavlovna has told me something new," I said at last, turning resolutely to Versilov. "Yes, certainly I am such a lackey that I can't be satisfied with Versilov's not having apprenticed me to a shoemaker. Even rights did not touch me. I wanted the whole of Versilov. I wanted a father. That's what I asked for, like a regular lackey. Mother, I've had it on my conscience for 8 years, when you came to Moscow alone to see me at Touchard's, the way I received you then. But I have no time to speak of it now. Tatyana Pavlovna won't let me tell the story. Goodbye till tomorrow, Mother. We may see each other again. Tatyana Pavlovna, what if I am so utterly a lackey that I am quite unable to admit the possibility of a man's marrying again when his wife is alive? Yet you know that all but happened to Andrei Petrovitch at Ems. Mother, if you don't want to stay with a husband who may take another wife tomorrow, remember you have a son who promises to be a dutiful son to you forever. Remember, and let us go away, only on condition that it is either he or I, will you? I don't ask you for an answer at once, of course. I know that such questions can't be answered straight off. But I could not go on, partly because I was excited and confused. My mother turned pale, and her voice seemed to fail her. She could not utter a word. Tatyana Pavlovna said something in a very loud voice and at great length, which I could not make out. And twice she pushed me on the shoulder with her fist. I only remember that she shouted that my words were a sham, the broodings of a petty soul, counted over and turned inside out. Versilov sat motionless and very serious. He was not smiling. I went upstairs to my room. The last thing I saw as I went out was the reproach in my sister's eyes. She shook her head at me sternly. Breaking in. I find the interpersonal and intrapersonal dynamics in this chapter to be fascinating on multiple levels, although I'll postpone comment on them until later. We now have a fuller history of Arkady's childhood. His earliest years were spent under the care of Versilov's aunt in the country, after which he was moved into the household of Andronikov in Moscow, the very same Andronikov who recently bequeathed sensitive documents to others, including 2 that Arkady has in his possession. Arkady was in his house roughly between the ages of 6 and 10 or 11, before his first encounter with Versilov, which was immediately followed by his stay at Touchard's boarding school. And as we already know, his teenage years in Moscow were spent under the roof of Nikolai Semyonovich and his wife Marya Ivanovna, the latter being Andronikov's niece. We can learn something from this history. While Versilov himself has had precious little interaction with his illegitimate son, it is through his contacts that Arkady has been provided for at every stage of his childhood. And the kind of upbringing he has received would be the envy of any Russian peasant. Despite the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, no peasant would have had the legal right to attend a gymnasium or university in the 1870s. And Arkady, while legally the son of a peasant, has been given the rights of a nobleman. It is Tatyana Pavlovna who fiercely reminds Arkady of this fact at the end of this chapter. And we have one of the first moments in this novel where the reader, immersed for so long in the mind of Arkady, gets a dose of reality to which our angsty adolescent is blind. It won't be the last time. Indeed, the only defective adult caretakers in Arkady's childhood are Touchard and his wife. The unhappy environment of Touchard's boarding school is based upon the author's own unhappy childhood experience at a boarding school run by one Suchard. Dostoevsky changed the name between drafts. We know that more happened during Arkady's time at Touchard's than is related here. He mentions a classmate who gave him an education on the meaning of illegitimacy and who forced him to wait on him in servile ways. That is, of course, Lambert, about whom we previously heard in chapters 2 and 3. And Arkady's mother came to visit him at the school once. Perhaps we will hear more of these episodes as the novel proceeds. Andronikov, it seems, gave the young Arkady a better education and a great deal of exposure to literature. A Sportsman's Sketches is a rather mature collection of short stories published by Ivan Turgenev in 1852. Ivan Krylov, whose verses Arkady quoted in Versilov's study, was an author and translator of fables, written at a higher level and with more satirical flavor than the classic stories of Aesop. And Woe from Wit is an 1823 play by Griboyedov, which arguably introduces the concept of the superfluous man into Russian literature. Versilov acts the role of Chatsky, who is the protagonist of the play, something like a romantic Byronic hero who is disaffected by the aristocratic society he inherits and who loses out in a tangled love triangle that has no satisfactory resolution. Chatsky is sometimes compared to Hamlet, but the play has too much comedic irony in it for the comparison to go through cleanly. We can see, nevertheless, how the spectacle would have entranced the impressionable Arkady, and we can ask whether Versilov might have a bit more in common with Chatsky than merely his one-night performance of the role 9 years ago. But the Versilov that Arkady has just heard about from Kraft falls far short of that ideal. It's worth observing that the sour tone in the evening's banter begins with Versilov's brushing off Tatyana Pavlovna's suggestion to be generous to the Sokolskys, who have just lost that lawsuit. The grand aristocratic gentleman of Arkady's imagination would not be so ruthless. And, of course, Arkady has a further character test that he can run against his father, given the letter he has just received from Kraft. When he blows up in the final scene with accusations of infidelity, He is referring, of course, to Vrasilov's proposal to the unfortunate, and now deceased, Lydia Akhmakova at Ems. He knows in advance that Tatyana Pavlovna is aware of that episode, but it is unclear what his mother and sister know of it, and he seems to think that he is giving his mother new information. Tatyana Pavlovna insists that he is twisting things. We obviously have much to learn yet. End of comments.